This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Jonathan Bennett and I talk with Jared Watts and Nic Cope, who are founding engineers both with a company called Upbound, and what they work on is Crossplane. And control planes are this really interesting category, and it has to do here with Kubernetes, and they have a gigantic community involved in this thing, over 9,000 members of a Slack channel, and they're there for a reason. And that reason is why you should be listening to this, and that's coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 738, recorded Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. Crossplane, your cockpit in the cloud. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Collide. Collide is a device trust solution that ensures that if a device isn't secure, it can't access your apps. It's zero trust for Okta. Visit collide.com/floss and book a demo today.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.
Hello again, everyone, everywhere. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly. This week, joined by Jonathan Bennett himself. There in
the man himself.
The man himself, who looks short in his tall chair. Even though he's tall, so it must be a very tall chair.
Big chair.
Your high chair. Your high chair today.
Oh goodness.
So how you doing, Jonathan?
Low blow, Doc. I'm good. I'm good, sir. It has been a good week. It's good to be here again.
Yeah, it's great to be here too. So are you familiar with Crossplane, which is sort of our focus today?
I was not until looking forward to the show, and I've done some reading and research about what they do, and it's interesting. It's kind of like they liked Kubernetes so much they decided, why don't we run all the things using the Kubernetes API? And so you can connect to AWS. It's kind of like I think of it almost like a backplane on an old school server. And so you can connect to AWS, you can connect to Azure, but then you can treat all of those things almost like they're just part of one big Kubernetes instance. And they kind of have the magic software that lets you do that. And it runs on Kubernetes too. So it's kind of Kubernetes all the way down. It looks pretty cool. I'm looking forward to hearing their elevator pitch and learning more about the way it works.
We'll take the elevator as high as we can. I'm not familiar with it either, especially, but I am familiar with the cloud native thing, which I've followed for a number of years, and I'm really curious to know where it applies. What are they doing with it? So with that out of the way, I want to bring in Jared Watts and Nic Cope, coming to us from Belgium and somewhere on the West Coast, respectively. They're both with Upbound, which is a company working on this. And so I'm going to leave it up to you guys. You can pick which one comes first. Tell us about yourselves and how and what you're doing and all that.
Yeah, how about Nic, I start, and then we'll kind of segue into you, especially with the recent publication you authored about the project and what we're doing. That might be a good place to start after that. Thanks a lot for having us today. Definitely grateful to be here. So my name is Jared Watts. Looks like I'm missing an S at the end of my name there, but we'll still know who I am here. I know who I am still, at least. So I am one of the creators of the Crossplane project. So I've been working on it since the very, very beginning. Been an amazing ride on that, especially as we're growing the community and, getting more adopters of the project and such. I started my career though at Microsoft working on Windows Server stuff. First startup I did was a peer-to-peer storage network. That was pretty fun. I had a storage background for a while as well before getting into cloud native stuff, Kubernetes and all that, and then starting a couple different open source projects within that ecosystem. And about you, Nic?
Hey folks, I'm Nick. I've also been working on Crossplane for a long time. Oh, by the way, somewhere in the West Coast for me is Seattle. I'm in the Seattle area. I haven't been working on Crossplane for quite as long as Jared, but almost. My background is SRE and platform engineering, so I'm pretty passionate about what we do on Crossplane because we're building this tool largely for platform engineers and SRE folks. Outside of work, massive pinball player, dog parent. And I think that report that Jared was alluding to was I recently wrote an introduction to Crossplane for O'Reilly, which came out last month or thereabouts. So if folks want a deeper dive into what Crossplane is, you can check that out later.
So this is an O'Reilly book. Does it have a special animal in the cover?
It does not. It's not a book. It's a report. It's a mini book. It's something like 30 pages long or something like that. It's got some stripes on the cover.
That's one kind of animal. So, tell us about the relationship between Crossplane and Upbound, where you're working, and I assume there is one. So.
Yeah, definitely. So Upbound is a startup that we formed in the Seattle area a little bit over 5 years ago. And so within Upbound is where we created the Crossplane project. We were working on it internally there, amongst the team of engineers. And then we decided to, take it to the public and open source it, probably about 3 or so months after we started working on it. We thought it was a good idea. We wanted to build a community around it. So the relationship is that Upbound and the team of engineers there is the creators of the Crossplane project. We're still very, very heavily involved in it as well, and building. We have a lot of our engineers are still focusing on it, and we're building a business around it, all that sort of stuff. So that is the relationship: is that we're the creators and the stewards of the project still to this day.
All right. Hey, Nick, you used a term there, an acronym. We're going to do a little bit of magic decoding here. What is an SRE, and how does that relate to Crossplane?
SRE, Site Reliability Engineer, one of the, I don't know how controversial, this will be one of the many terms that, folks have had for systems administrators, DevOps people, what you might think of as a platform engineer as the more modern terminology. I started my career at Google, who coined the term SRE. So my first jobs was Site Reliability Engineering at Google. I would say, and then similar at Spotify and another company called Planet Labs. But I would say that what I've actually been doing has been more what we would think of as platform engineering today. Mm-hmm. So definitely focused on a lot of writing software to build a sort of a productivity platform for my peer engineers at these various companies. Sort of thing. SRE has become pretty broad, so I think it's anything that involves keeping the lights on sort of can fall into that bucket. So I would say I was in the platform building niche of SRE.
So SRE is a fancy way of saying sysadmin.
Right. I went to college for being a sysadmin, but then all of my job titles have been SRE up until now.
That makes sense. All right. I think I want to pitch this back over to Jared and kind of start getting at the basics here. What does Crossplane do? Is it related to Kubernetes? How is it related to Kubernetes? Like, what problem are we solving with Crossplane?
Yeah, really good question. And it's a great place to start this conversation, go a little bit more deeply. So I think, before we talk about the specifics of its, relation to Kubernetes and how it runs in a cluster and all that sort of stuff, I think it's really the high level, way to look at it here is that, think about a scenario where you've got application developers in your organization. They have, some service that they're building and they need to deploy it to production. So in addition to, whatever service and business logic they're building, oftentimes they're going to need some infrastructure and supporting resources. So that could be databases, message queues, buckets, you name it, right? Like Amazon has hundreds of services available in AWS, and application developers may need access to, any number of those, right? So, there's a couple ways you could solve that. You could give those developers direct access to, say, the GCP console or the AWS console, but that's not a good idea at all, especially at scale, for any number of reasons. Then there's some other approaches, like one we call kind of refer to as ticket ops, where the application developers can open a ticket to the SRE, DevOps, sysadmin, platform team requesting infrastructure to be made. And it kind of slows things down while you're, waiting for that to be solved, and and then that's kind of making the developers that need their services to get to production to just another part of the process, right? And so we found that there is potentially a better way to do that, and it's not the only way to do it, but a better way to do it is to build a platform instead. And this is what Nick was referring to around platform engineers, right? Where you can have a standardized, common way for your developers to get the services they need, get the infrastructure they need, and be able to ship their code to production and have, a common environment, and standardized, monitoring, alerting, observability, best practices, policy, all that sort of stuff, but be able to kind of give a little bit more power to the developers so that they can come to your platform, get everything they need, get to production, and maintain velocity basically in a standardized way. So that's kind of the high level problem that we were going after there. And then maybe I'll turn it over to Nick to kind of start talking about a layer below of, okay, so what is Crossplane then approaching that high level problem?
Sure.
Yeah, just to follow on from what Jared was saying, one way that I like to think about it is that I think what the cloud providers have done is appealing to people, right? You've got this smorgasbord of infrastructure stuff. You can do databases, clusters, caches, all that kind of thing. And then you've got these various interfaces to work with them to self-service. So you can hit an API directly, or you can use their CLI tools, or you can use their web console. But it's overwhelming. There's so much of it. It's a lot to ask for the average developer to go and learn all the things that they need to do there. And it's a lot to ask for an SRE or platform team to sort of trust those developers with the keys to the kingdom to those 900 services or something like that AWS has, for example. So what I think of Crossplane as putting on my SRE hat, and what I would have wanted back in the day is imagine if you could build that experience yourself and take away all the sharp edges and focus and frame it on your organization's concepts and your concerns. Everywhere I've worked, you build up a culture in the organization, terminology, ways of thinking about the world. Imagine if you could sort of build your own little lens into the cloud with maybe its own CLIs and web portals and APIs and all that kind of thing that framed everything in your org's concepts. And we see Crossplane as kind of the control plane for that. It doesn't have those CLIs and web consoles and all that baked in, but it is the heart of it. It is sort of the backbone of building a system like that. And the way we've done that, we kind of saw that Kubernetes was an excellent framework for that. Kubernetes, everyone thinks of it as a way to orchestrate containers, but we really thought that the strong point of it was its architecture, its APIs, and the way that it reaches out and orchestrates things based on state put in the APIs. So we thought effectively, why don't we take those parts? Why don't we sort of put maybe the container stuff to one side, take the parts that we think are really strong, the API and the controller pattern, which we can get into a little bit later, and kind of just apply that to everything. But I think the other thing that's kind of neat there is that there's layers of abstractions that can be built there. So I think one of the key things that we've landed on today in Crossplane is we don't really want to tell you, here's what we think a database should look like. You all said databases were too complicated, so we all sat down and we have the perfect database abstraction, trust us. Instead, we say, we think you should tell us what the perfect database abstraction is for your company, or the perfect cache abstraction, or the perfect VM abstraction, or whatever. You tell us, what should this API look like? And then you teach us what to do when someone calls that API.
So is Crossplane primarily meant to be a development tool, or is it for deployments, or is it to kind of have a lifetime that includes both?
Yeah, I think a good way to look at that is that, part of the design and the surface area and the experience that Crossplane exposes is very much conscious of a separation of concerns and multiple different personas. When you are as this core platform team that is, servicing these application developers around them, that platform sysadmin DevOps type of persona, it's definitely a tool for them to, capture what is important in their platform. What resources do they want to expose? What's the configuration and policy that they want to be enforced? All of that sort of stuff. So that's one persona of, the DevOps type of person. And then the entirely different persona of the application developer that, wants to use infrastructure, wants to access it and provision it in a self-service way, but, isn't necessarily going to be given the keys to the kingdom to do that on them, all on their own. This platform team will define, here's the configuration knobs that you can turn for your databases. Here's what you're allowed to do for your queues and your buckets, et cetera. And so, that strong separation of concerns where the platform people in charge of your infrastructure, the ones that are, likely on call as well for making sure that it's up and running, et cetera, they've got a different usage of Crossplane, and they're definitely one of the core personas. But then I guess at the end, it's mostly in service of that application developer persona that needs cloud resources and infrastructure, et cetera, for the purpose of getting their applications running and deployed.
And then I'm assuming Crossplane also has built into it a lot of monitoring tools, maybe even a fancy dashboard. So after an app is developed and deployed, it's out there, it's running on the cloud, then you can go back into Crossplane and say, what's the health of all of this? How much, what sort of resource utilization am I pulling off of AWS? Am I going to have a huge Azure bill at the end of the month?
Not so much, because we think of Crossplane as really, we think that's absolutely something that I think a good platform should have. But we've got a pretty scoped charter for Crossplane. So we're really focused on just being the backbone, just being the control plane. We're a component of a good platform rather than trying to probably I would hope or argue the core component of a good platform, but we're not aiming to be the entire platform. We definitely see a lot of people mixing and matching Crossplane with other cloud native tools. Backstage comes to mind, for example, to get that like web console experience. We see people mixing and matching it with tools like Prometheus to get monitoring and whatnot. So we're not trying to be sort of the whole thing, but we are trying to be the control plane, the core logic, the orchestration sort of tool that powers all of this.
Yeah, so I imagine then that you've got to kind of get Crossplane into the scenario while you're still on the whiteboard. Like you've identified the problem you want to solve, and you're starting to think about how you're going to architect it. That's the point where you go, hey, we should use Crossplane.
Potentially. I mean, we do see people sort of trying out other things and migrating to Crossplane once they sort of realize maybe that we solve some of the pain points that they have. Often the pain point is sort of getting back to what we were talking about before. People might have some other way of managing their infrastructure, but they don't. What they're using doesn't lead too much into self-service. They start to think, man, I really, they being a platform team or SRE team or something like that, so start to think, man, I'd really love it if my developers didn't have to raise a ticket to me to ask to get some infrastructure. I think of this along two axes, right? Safety and efficiency. Sort of the things that Jared was getting at before is if you just give everyone straight on access to the AWS Cloud Console or the Google Cloud Console, it's somewhat efficient, right? But it's probably not as safe. If everyone raises a ticket to you, that's probably pretty safe because you can apply your best practices as someone who knows the cloud really well, but it's not very efficient. Whereas if you offer them an API, you offer them a control plane that you've designed so it doesn't have any sharp edges, or hopefully if you've designed it well, it doesn't have any sharp edges, then they can go through that and they're getting the efficiency, but they're also getting the safety as well. They're not having to go and, you're not in the critical path as an SRE when a developer needs to say, hey, I'm deploying an app and I need a database that's going to support my app for its entire life cycle, or a queue or cluster to run it on, whatever you need when you're building apps.
Yeah, Nick, I really like that, thinking about that on the two axes. That's a really good way to look at it. And then something to kind of add on to what you're saying there is that, when you think about the way that Crossplane is exposing all of its resources that you can, go and provision, all this cloud infrastructure and, these abstractions you can define on top of it for your devs, et cetera. At the end of the day, they're all really APIs that you're exposing, right? So it does kind of facilitate facilitate a high level of integration or reuse, whatever, from other projects and other, tools in the ecosystem. It's not like there's one front door into how you use Crossplane, and that's the only way you can do it. There's an API surface area similar to Kubernetes in general, where you can use a whole, ecosystem of tools or processes or methodologies or, user interfaces or whatever. So it's nice to be kind of API first, API driven, and then that opens up a lot of doors for how one could access and consume this platform that you're building with Crossplane.
So if you're API driven, is there a graphical client that comes with Crossplane, or does a developer kind of have to bootstrap and build his own little GUI to even be able to get started? It's fascinating. It's kind of a different approach to things, I think, than most of us are used to.
Yeah, Nick, maybe you can add on to this, but the simple answer there is that it is all of the entities within Crossplane that represent real world objects out there, such as databases and buckets and stuff. All of those entities within the Crossplane's API are captured and represented in the same way that other objects within the Kubernetes API is. So pods, config maps, deployments, those typical primitives that you have in the Kubernetes API. Crossplane extends all of that and adds, Cloud SQL or, Amazon's Kubernetes service or, all these sort of things like that. So that's the however you are already accessing your Kubernetes, objects in Kubernetes API surface area. You could use those exact same tools that to access Crossplane as well, because it's just an extension of the Kubernetes API.
Right. This is definitely one reason we see folks coming to Crossplane as well, is what I would think of as tooling consistency. If you're a shop that's already using Kubernetes, you might already have a web portal or a dashboard that's able to sort of work with anything in the Kubernetes API. And you've probably got a CLI, kubectl being the one that sort of comes with Kubernetes that people use to interact with that particular API. So all of those things just work with Crossplane as well. So folks feel that that's kind of nice because they can just add this capability into their existing platform without having to sort of buy into an entire sort of Crossplane ecosystem.
So when you go to use kubectl to create and deploy an app, you can just define extra resources that Kubernetes normally has no clue what you're talking about, but because you've got Crossplane in the mix, it just works. Is that how this is put together? Because that's pretty cool.
Right, exactly. And then it's interesting. Like a lot of the time, I actually found this while I was working on this report recently. People who've used Kubernetes a lot sense an intuitive goodness to it. So a lot of the reason that we hear, well, people, a lot of people don't like the complexity and whatnot, but a lot of people sort of are like, I like the way that Kubernetes work. And then when you go and look at why that is, I think a lot of it is you tell Kubernetes about your desired state, and Kubernetes is a long, the API server in Kubernetes is a long running process. It, runs on a server somewhere, and it's sitting there constantly being like, okay, I remember that Nick told me I want this database to be 30 gig. And every, configurable interval, every, let's say 60 seconds, it's going to go and double check, is that database still 60 gig? And if someone goes around Crossplane or around Kubernetes and goes to the cloud and says, actually, I want this database to go be 100 gig now, Crossplane's going to notice and be like, I was told the desired state should be this. I will make sure that I'll reset that change. I'll set it back to, I actually forget what number I said originally, 20 gig or 30 gig or whatever it was. So I think this effectively what people want is they want a control plane for managing their infrastructure. And Kubernetes is just a really good control plane. So I think that's kind of what gets people excited about it. I don't know if it's worth also I don't have a whiteboard here, but I do want to kind of try and use my hands maybe, though that won't work for anyone who's not watching the video. There's kind of two layers to Crossplane, right? At the core layer, at the base layer, we have what we call managed resources. And a managed resource, I think of that as a high fidelity representation of something in the cloud. So AWS has an RDS API, that's their sort of SQL database API. We take all of those and we bring them into the Kubernetes API server. So at the base layer, you can say, hey, Crossplane, I want an RDS. And you make an API call to it that looks just like making an API call to AWS. And then what Crossplane is going to do is make sure that AWS is always configured the way that you told Crossplane it should be configured. It's going to sit there forever, always making sure that your design state is what AWS is actually like. If anyone changes it in AWS, deletes it in AWS, does anything, Crossplane's sitting there and it'll go, I'll correct that. So that's kind of the base foundation. So that gets you some of the benefits of sort of having a control plane that you control to keep your infrastructure in your desired state. But it doesn't help with complexity. It doesn't help with cognitive challenges of basically. I think the RDS API has something like 50 configuration fields on it. That's a lot for a developer to remember. So then above that managed resource layer at the heart of Crossplane, we have effectively abstractions. And that's where a platform team can come in and say, here's how I want to frame a database. I work for Acme Co, so I think it should be an Acme database. And maybe for weird historical regions, my organization calls what AWS would call a region or a zone, a location or a place, or something like that. So I can just change that terminology. In my API, it's called a place, and my developers can think about it the way that they've always thought about it. And when someone makes that API call, Crossplane's going to resolve that to some concrete, high fidelity managed resources. And then those are going to go and get applied to the cloud. I don't know if that all made sense. It's kind of a lot to unpack.
That's great.
Well, I have some questions about the actual users. You've got a Slack channel with 7,500 participants, and I'd really love to know what the conversation there is. But first, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Collide. Collide is a device trust solution that ensures unsecured devices can't access your apps. Collide has some big news. If you're an Okta user, Collide can get your entire fleet to 100% compliance. Collide patches one of the major holes in zero trust architecture, device compliance. Think about it. Your identity provider only lets known devices log into apps, but just because a device is known doesn't mean it's in a secure state. In fact, plenty of devices in your fleet probably shouldn't be trusted. Maybe they're running on out-of-date versions, or maybe they've got unencrypted credentials lying around. If a device isn't compliant or running the Collide agent, it can't access the organization's SaaS apps or other resources. The device user can't log into your company's cloud apps until they've fixed the problem at their end. It's that simple. For example, a device will be blocked if an employee doesn't have an up-to-date browser. Using end-user remediation helps drive your fleet to 100% compliance without overwhelming your IT team. Without Collide, IT teams have no way to solve these compliance issues or stop insecure devices from logging in. With Collide, you can set and enforce compliance across your entire fleet, Mac, Windows, and Linux. Collide is unique in that it makes device compliance part of the authentication process. When a user logs in with Okta, Collide alerts them to compliance issues and prevents unsecured devices from logging in. It's security you can feel good about because Collide puts transparency and respect for users at the center of their product. To sum it up, Collide's method means fewer support tickets, less frustration, and most importantly, 100% fleet compliance. Visit collide.com/floss to learn more or book a demo. That's KOLIDE.com/floss. So guys, I'm looking on your homepage, on the Crossplane homepage, that is. You scroll down and there's 7,500 Slack members. It says, and there's Intel, Trivago, Accenture, Mercedes, IBM, Verizon, and they kind of this kind of a cute hack there where some disappear and others reappear. It's kind of mesmerizing. So I'm wondering what goes on there. I mean, and I'm curious to know what, even if you could pick one of them and walk us through what a typical issue might be, or what some of the participants there are, bringing up and where that goes. Does it go into code, for example? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Doc, and that kind of gets to probably a number of aspects of the community that we're building up around this open source Crossplane project. So, Slack is one of the channels that we have to engage and collaborate together as a community on the project. And I think actually that our Crossplane.io website there, front page there, is a little bit out of date. I think it's over 9,000 folks on Slack now, chatting and talking, et cetera. But it's pretty typical for folks to think about adopting the Crossplane project and kind of the phases they go through. It's pretty typical that folks will, first they hear about Crossplane in some way, a highly popular podcast such as this is a good example of folks hearing about it right for the first time. They get interested, they come check out the website there, and maybe they dip their toes in the water with some getting started guides to get a initial feel of what it's like to manage infrastructure, manage their cloud resources from a control plane architecture like Crossplane. And then often, if they want to start kind of understanding, okay, what else can I do here? Or, hey, I'm running into an issue here. Or, wow, Crossplane is, seems like it's got a lot of power, but what are some more things I can do with it? Or how do I solve this scenario that is important to my organization? And so folks often join our Slack channel, and that's where we have a lot of high fidelity, high bandwidth conversations of, folks kind of sharing their ideas, kind of giving us good feedback, asking about new things that, we as an engineering team that have been working on this maybe haven't even thought of yet, right? So it's, a very good mechanism to connect to the community and, collaborate on all this sort of stuff and really kind of make it, it takes a village, right? So kind of having a larger base of folks that are contributing in any number of ways to the project, and discussing on Slack is just one of those, right? Nick, is there any more you want to add on that in terms of, what people are using Crossplane for? I think you had some good stuff that you kind of talked directly to people about that very recently on.
Yeah, I could. I will say also Jared has worked on our customer community team a lot more than me, so I think you might have some better ideas. But the one that comes immediately to mind right now that we see a lot of folks setting up is this, I think a term I've heard for it a lot is landing zones. So at really big enterprises, a pattern that we're seeing, Fortune 100 companies, a pattern that we're seeing is that there are probably multiple central platform teams, but one of those platform teams is kind of maybe the core platform team, and their job is to just set up an environment that a development team will work in. So let's say there's some new fairly large development team, fairly large project working on a wing of the business. Maybe it's like a car configurator website or something like that. You've got like let's say 20 plus people in that team working on that. Those folks will often these days get their own, for that project, for that team, their own entire AWS account or Google account or Azure account. And that'll need its own VPC network set up in it. It probably maybe needs some subnets, some IAM rules, just a lot of foundational infrastructure. And this comes even before you ever start setting up databases and queues and the things that actually power your app. This is just like the place to run your app in the first place. So a lot of what we see folks coming to us is they want people to be able to self-service and say, hi, I would like one of those landing zones. I'd like you to set me up an AWS account and a VPC and some subnets and some IAM roles and all that kind of stuff in the standard way that is compliant and approved by my platform team. But that's a lot, for the average developer. That's, without Crossplane, that is going to involve, maybe making 20 different API calls or going to the AWS console and duping to 20 different pages and setting up a lot of fairly complex, setups that need deep systems knowledge, deep networking knowledge to make sure that you're doing well as just deep knowledge of what a cloud provider you're doing. So with Crossplane, what we'll see the platform team doing is saying, hey, we've taught Crossplane, we've taught our control plane about this concept called a landing zone. And when you ask Crossplane for a landing zone, which maybe has 15, 20 configurable knobs on it, maybe what region should it be in? Is it a big one or a small one or something like that? We'll just go and set up all those things for you on demand. And when I say we, I'm saying Crossplane's going to do that. You use your kubectl or your web console or make an API call somehow to Crossplane and say, I'd like a landing zone. Crossplane says, cool, I know what that means. The platform team taught me that a landing zone means I need to go and create you an AWS account. I need to go and create you a VPC. I need to go and create you a couple of IAM roles, some subnets, all that kind of stuff. And not only do I need to create them, but I need to make sure they stay this way forever. I need to monitor them for their entire life cycle and make sure that they always look the way that the platform team said they should look. If anyone changes them, I should change them back. And so this is a pretty common thing, especially for folks early in their Crossplane adoption, because after that, eventually, now that you've got that landing zone, then you can start to, kind of build an infrastructure catalog almost of, things that you could go and add to that landing zone to actually power your app, the databases, the queues, all those things that you think of as a, modern cloud application being powered by.
In that scenario that you're explaining there, Nick, of offering a landing zone to developers and new teams and new parts of your org or business units or whatever that are getting off the ground in your organization, I think a real awesome way that I continually hear from our adopters and people in the community, et cetera, to a way to really see the value that provides is that we commonly hear from folks, and they're people that give talks about this at events such as KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, and other events like that, Open Source Summit, whatever, is that they often talk about the time for new projects to get spun up or the time for services to get deployed, et cetera. It gets drastically reduced. So that scenario Nick was talking about spinning up a new landing zone and all the complicated machinery, et cetera, there. A lot of folks have given us that feedback that, hey, this used to take weeks. Maybe we can measure it in months to get a new landing zone spun up and a new team up and running. And now we can measure it in hours as opposed to weeks or months. And so people are drastically accelerating their journey into the cloud and getting things up and running much, much faster with this pattern here and the reusability and the standard infrastructure catalog and all that sort of stuff. And every time I hear that, it's definitely something that speaks to the value of what we're building here.
Right. It's really all about that, safety and efficiency. Overall, what these platform teams want to do, they want to be a force multiplier for for the teams they support. They want to help them go faster and be blocked less in getting the things they need to be productive, but they want them to do it safely. They want them to do it, with some guardrails.
I'm curious about. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
While talking through that scenario, I completely forgot about something earlier when we were talking about web consoles and CLIs and things like that. A really common pattern that we see for people wanting to interact with Crossplane is actually putting all of this configuration in a Git repository. What people would call GitOps these days. I feel like we've been doing it my entire career, but the term these days is GitOps. So something that we commonly see is, I love a good web console. I think that people learn really well from web consoles. I think that they'll always exist. But once you've learned those concepts, what we see from people is they want to say, okay, my platform team as a developer has defined this concept of a landing zone when, i.e., my AWS account and all that kind of thing. When I want one of those, what I'm actually going to do is go to our central landing zone repository, and I'm just going to commit a bit of YAML basically to that document, to that Git repo rather. A YAML document that just describes what my landing zone is. Is it on the West Coast or the East Coast? Is it in Europe? Is it big, small, et cetera, et cetera? Is it purple or green? And when they commit that to Git, there's plenty of tools out there already that can sync that from Git to Crossplane. There's plenty of tools that can do that because they all support the Kubernetes API. And then you get this nice sort of all the benefits of revision control for your infrastructure. Someone else in your team can go review it and say, "Yep, that looks good. That's exactly what we want for a landing zone." And then you're unblocked and Crossplane springs into action.
So I'm wondering about. We haven't talked yet about Upbound, your company. Both of you work for Upbound, and so tell us about the company, how it relates to Crossplane, what your role in it is or within the community. Seems like there's a lot of possibilities there.
Yeah, definitely. There is. And so, we just briefly mentioned earlier, right, that, Upbound is the creators of the Crossplane project. We started it, for almost 5 years ago, internally at Upbound, and then made it a public open source project to build a big ecosystem and community around it, et cetera. But then, beyond that, Upbound is building a business around Crossplane, right? We're building a product and experience around Crossplane. So, one way to look at this is that what's good for Upbound as a company and as a business, what is good for Crossplane as a project is going to also benefit Upbound as a business as well, right? And so This isn't our first open source project. We also, some of us that created the Crossplane project also created another popular cloud native project. It's called Rook, and it's all about storage orchestration in the Kubernetes ecosystem. And so, we understand the value of building a community, building a strong, strong project and technology and having a strong vision there and a charter that's well articulated and governance and all that sort of stuff, right? So, we've got something I think that is well defined around Crossplane and the open source community and project and all that sort of stuff. And then Upbound as a business, has a lot of opportunities to build on top of that, and build a whole number of things that we can get into. But just a couple off the top of our heads are all sorts of enterprise integration and things that you need to run at scale. Things that you need to run across massive organizations, auditing and common logging, billing, metering, cost control, compliance, all that sort of stuff. So there's a nice core of building a cloud native control plane and managing your infrastructure and everything that's available in core Crossplane, and then enterprise scale, fleet management type of needs, et cetera, and a wonderful user experience and all that sort of stuff is something that we believe is well solved with vendors within the Crossplane ecosystem, such as Upbound.
Right. So Crossplane actually has its own lightweight package manager built into it. It's Kubernetes-based package manager, but this actually allows you to do things like say, I need AWS support, please Crossplane. And then you basically just tell it, you give it a couple of lines of YAML, let's say, or make an API call that say, please create AWS support. And then the Crossplane package manager is going to go download what we call a provider, which extends Crossplane with AWS support. Or, it's not just clouds. It might be GitHub support for managing GitHub, or it might be SQL database support for actually like going creating rows in SQL tables and things like that. So Upbound has a marketplace, which you can loosely think of as like the Docker hub for Crossplane. It's a place that you can go not just to find Upbound's providers and extensions to Crossplane, but the whole community's providers and extensions to Crossplane. It is a Crossplane aware marketplace. So if you want to go and look at the AWS EC2 provider, it'll give you all the documentation for that. It'll teach you about all the things that provider could do and show you how to install it, all that kind of stuff. And then I would say Upbound's other key product is Upbound itself, which, as Jared said, is all about running Crossplane at scale, fleets of Crossplanes. We definitely tend to find that these Fortune 100, these big companies, they don't just need one Crossplane. They tend to find that they need a bunch of different control planes. Maybe they have a control plane per team, or maybe they have a control plane per region, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, there's a lot of moving parts to a Kubernetes control plane. Crossplane uses a lot of parts of a Kubernetes control plane. I think a common complaint about Kubernetes is it is challenging to deploy and keep running. And that becomes more challenging if you have 10 of them or 100 of them or something like that. So this is where Upbound comes in. It's sort of we'll take care of that for you sort of thing, whether you're doing it, wherever you need to do it.
I have a possibly trivial question, but Ant and I were talking about this yesterday. We were wondering what your symbol there is. It looks like a popsicle with a rainbow popsicle, but that may be a technical thing. I don't know. What is that?
With that, that's been the logo since the very, very first day of the project, and something that's nicely enabled with Crossplane's approach is it understands anything with an API. You can integrate with Crossplane in some way and have Crossplane provision resources there, manage them, all that sort of stuff, right? So multi-cloud is very much something that is a focus, or at least something that Crossplane enables of, okay, I need to provision resources in AWS, maybe Microsoft Azure, maybe Alibaba, whatever it may be. So there's multiple flavors to the cloud. And then, that popsicle there is a cute representation of all the flavors of a multi-cloud that you can have with Crossplane.
All right, I want to pick this back up and go in a slightly different direction, although it's related. I promise it is. But first question to start off with: what license is all of this under? Obviously, we're talking about open source. Which of the license did you guys choose for Crossplane?
Apache 2. We tried to, we picked a very permissive license, and there's really, so we donated the project to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is, a subset of the Linux Foundation, and so part of that, donating the project to the CNCF is, that it needs to have a permissive license. So Apache 2 is the license there that allows folks to do a lot with it and, build their own businesses around it and, all that sort of stuff that permissive license like Apache 2 allows you to do.
So does CNCF actually provide the governance for the project?
CNCF provides a lot of things. There's a lot of really mature projects in there. They provide a lot of services and, special interest groups and all that sort of stuff to help drive and define your governance and, contributor strategy and all that sort of stuff. So they help a lot with that, but they're also fairly hands off in the sense that the maintainers of the project can make the decisions about how they want to implement their governance and how they want to define, how the project is run and releases and all that sort of stuff. So the CNCF has a lot of services and facilitates a lot of that, but at the end of the day, the project gets to choose a lot about the specifics about how they run.
And so, how many of the the people that make those decisions, your maintainers, how many of them are part of the company versus from outside? I'm just curious.
Yeah, really good question. So I think on the core maintainer team of Crossplane, I think there are 5 total maintainers right now, and 4 of those are part of Upbound that have been engineers there for. 3 are Upbound engineers or folks that have been contributing to it for a while. One is our newest maintainer that works for Nokia. And then another one is someone who is still a good friend of ours who worked at Upbound before, but now is going on to work at a infrastructure IoT type of company. So it's like, I guess 3 out of the 5 are currently at Upbound right now.
Okay,
so
that's right, Nick.
I think so. It's something like that. Definitely 2 of the maintainers are not Upbounders. But it's also important to note that, as Jared mentioned there, that's core Crossplane, right? So Crossplane as an overall ecosystem exists over a lot of repositories. So we have an entire GitHub org Crossplane contrib that has a lot of community-driven providers, and those providers that add arguably kind of the core, the base functionality for Crossplane, things like connecting to AWS or any particular cloud, any particular thing that Crossplane can manage. A lot of those are managed by completely not Upbound people, sort of thing. Within the broader ecosystem, it's quite a diverse set of maintainers.
Sure. So something I'm curious about is, let's just say that, hypothetically speaking, there is a new cloud provider that announces a really nifty service. What does the process look like to making Crossplane aware of that? Is that something that Upbound would do? Is that something that members of the community could pay Upbound to do, or do you normally just see those things come from somebody scratching their own itch?
Yeah, Nick, do you want to take this one, or I'm happy to also?
I'll take a shot, and then maybe you can cool. Add your flavor to it. Specifically saying a new cloud provider popped up is interesting, right? Because it depends. If a new cloud provider just poofed into existence today at the scale of AWS, that's a pretty big hill to climb, right? If they showed up with like 2 or 3 services, sort of thing, that is fairly straightforward, right? So adding support for a new cloud provider basically means building one or more Crossplane providers. From a software engineering perspective, for the folks who build these providers, which are maintainers of Crossplane, kind of anything that the cloud could do. So I'll just stick with my RDS example. We provide a little interface at the software level that says, teach us how to create, read, update, and delete this. Teach us how to CRUD it. And then we'll build everything else around that for you fairly automatically. But even just teaching Crossplane how to CRUD things becomes quite a challenging problem if there's like 900 things to CRUD in AWS, for example.
Right.
So for what we've done so far, when we've sort of come into this world, obviously after cloud providers, and there's just a lot of surface area, is we lean on a combination of code generation. So we basically look to other systems that sort of know how to orchestrate the clouds and generate code around them. Combination of that with community member contributions. But we have also found that it does help. It's not critical, but it does help with quality to have sort of a core team of people stewarding all those contributions. So Upbound has some what we call official providers, which are basically providers that Upbound has put together where we staff a team of people. Those providers are open source. They belong to Upbound. They're in our GitHub org, but they are Apache 2. we have a team of engineers who work on those and they steward them and make sure they're high quality. But we get a ton of community contributions there. And we also leverage a lot of code generation to make it faster to build those providers. We also have a bunch of what we would call community providers, and those are the ones that many of them just have no Upbound involvement at all. A team of community people are coming together to scratch their own itch. They tend to be maybe a little bit more the long tail rather than the behemoths like AWS or something. So if a little new cloud showed up tomorrow that only a couple of folks want, probably a community provider would start from that, and they would, get the ball rolling there. And if that cloud provider became something that hundreds or thousands of people were beating down our door saying, we really want that, then it might sort of, become an efficient provider and get some more resources put on it.
Yeah, and I think it's really nice that, this ecosystem and community we've built, right, definitely facilitates that type of engagement from contributors and from the community to scratch their own itch, right? And like one good example that I've saw kind of recently is, DigitalOcean. The provider that is now in the Crossplane ecosystem and helps you provision and manage resources in DigitalOcean. That was driven by folks at DigitalOcean that, saw some value in, integrating into and having support for DigitalOcean from within Crossplane and, went and got it bootstrapped and got support for some of the critical resources there. And, have it published and ready as well too. So this nice spectrum of community and code generation and cloud provider themselves involvement and Upbound's involvement as a vendor and other vendors as well. It's nice to have kind of a spectrum of ways to solve a fairly large surface area of things you can do in the cloud and things with APIs, right? It's a big surface area, so it does take a village once again.
Yeah. Right, and to be a little bit more concrete on the code generation stuff, a lot of the incumbent, Crossplane's relatively new compared to AWS, compared to Google, etc. But there are other open source tools that know how to talk to Google that have had years and years, or talk to AWS. Tools like Terraform, for example. So Crossplane, we have tooling where you could just basically point the tooling at a Terraform provider and say, hey, here's a Terraform provider, please make a Crossplane provider for that. And it'll automate a lot of that. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Very cool. So one of the things that AWS spends a lot of time on is security and permissions. Like I have watched over the years when I first started with AWS, it was very simple. You created an Amazon account and then you generated a token and you used the token and that was it. You were done. And it's now a bit more complex than that, with IAM and all of those things. Now, when we talk about Crossplane, I imagine that there's kind of two sides to this, because you've got your Crossplane configuration where you set up some permissions inside of that. But then I assume there also has to be kind of an outward-facing security component where not just anyone can talk to your deployed Crossplane, and you probably have roles set up there too. How does that work? What is the security aspect of Crossplane?
Yeah, you pretty much got it right there, Jonathan, right? Where there are going to be multiple layers of it. So, that first layer is, okay, how does, whoever the Crossplane provider, let's say, that is going to be making the API call, over the wire to the cloud provider's, surface area of API and their control plane, it needs some credentials to do that. It needs to act on behalf of somebody, right? And so typically within the providers, we try to support the majority of the important authentication schemes and authentication mechanisms that are available for that. So for AWS, you can use long-term IAM user credentials. There's support for what's called IRSA, which is IAM roles for service accounts that integrates directly into Kubernetes. You can use assume identity and web identity, that sort of stuff too. But then you get above that next layer, right, where you've got Crossplane, it's got certain credentials in a certain way, and that can be stored in a number of ways as well. Maybe it's in, HashiCorp Vault or something like that too. But, it's going to be using those creds to make the actual calls. But then above that, access to Crossplane is the next layer, right? And so there, we typically rely on the RBAC scheme and functionality that is built into Kubernetes. So, you can provide, various entities and subjects that have access to the Kubernetes cluster. You can provide them, role-based access to, with certain verbs to certain resources. So, hey, this entity can only do create or update, but maybe not delete on this particular type. So RBAC access that's pretty standard in Kubernetes is the major way to do that. But then a really important point here is that there is that next layer, once again, where, in Crossplane, you can directly create an Amazon RDS database or a Google Cloud SQL, but you can also define your own abstraction that composes together multiple resources and offers that as a simplified API to your developers too. And there's RBAC at that level also. So at the end of the day, your developers only get one specific, access through RBAC to a high level Acme company database type, and they don't get any of that access to the lower level primitives of like RDS or Cloud SQL, and they certainly don't get access even lower than that to the cloud provider account credentials and things like that too. So I look at it as in 3 layers, and that's kind of the scheme that we use there.
I do want to point out really quick that this was a big part of Crossplane choosing to build on Kubernetes, right? We talk about Kubernetes being a great control plane, having to be built for containers, but great for everything else. All of this role-based access control, everything in Crossplane is fully encrypted, authenticated, all authentication, authorization. We just got all of that for free by picking the Kubernetes sort of infrastructure to build on. So that also means a lot of interoperability with other tools, like Jared mentioned IRSA as a way to authenticate to AWS. That just came for free for Crossplane because we chose to build on Kubernetes.
I want to get back we're getting a little bit low on time here, but I want to get back to the CNCF because it's interesting to me. Like the CNCF has this wonderful, gigantic graphic. I think my laptop certainly can't embrace it all. The cloud native interactive landscape, and it's changed a lot over the years. I went to their conference, Linux Foundation conference in San Jose in 2018. I just checked my calendar to see when it was. I just located the time as before the pandemic when I still went out. It was that kind of thing, right? And they still had conferences. But it's changed a lot. It has so many variables you can add. You can say which ones are open source and which ones aren't. They have one here, the cards from China. That's relatively new. And 2 things. One is where you fit in here, and also how the cloud native landscape, which you're part of in a big way, I think, has changed over the last few years. And what changes can we expect? Because it looks to me like it has more categories, getting more complex. It's almost becoming 3-dimensional.
Nick, do you want to answer how we fit into that? And then I'll talk about how it's changed over time.
I actually, I think that you're the best one to handle this. I remember that in the literal box that we're in, they put us in one of the fairly central, was it like orchestration or something like that, boxes on that diagram up there next to Kubernetes, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's where it is. Yeah. It's kind of hard to place Crossplane into its a existing category, because in some sense it's doing some new things and bringing control planes to the masses and kind of defining a new category of its own a little bit. But it's not grossly incorrect to have it as an orchestrator and next to Kubernetes as well, sort of like where if you think about, hey, I have a control plane and I need it to manage certain things. Kubernetes manages your containers and your container workloads, etc., and things that it needs for that. And then Crossplane extends that and enables you to manage the world, a lot of things there, so, and orchestrate and deploy and all that sort of stuff. So it's hard to fit it into this particular box there, but there's definitely reasons why it landed in that particular box that it landed in. And then, the cloud native landscape is actually really interesting, Doc, to me, because, we've been a part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation for quite a while, and especially with our earlier open source project that was one of the first few projects to graduate from the CNCF. So very, very early on. But I think it speaks to that we're onto something. That's this cloud native way of running our applications and getting things deployed and everything that comes along with it is very interesting. And there's a lot of ability and a lot of problems to solve and a lot of interesting capabilities and functionality that exists there. And so that landscape does keep exploding. And that something that I think that it remains important to me. 2 things. One is that the landscape as a whole, there's a lot of things out there. But one thing I do like about the CNCF is that,
in order to join the foundation and donate the project to the foundation, you go through a fairly rigorous process of technical vetting and due diligence, and a technical oversight committee of the CNCF examines it pretty heavily, and you really kind of make sure that the project has momentum, it's solving a real problem, that it has a nice niche that it's filling in the landscape, and all that sort of stuff. So there's good vetting of projects that join the CNCF, and so those projects that have gone through that vetting, you've got some confidence, some assurances around those that they've got a certain level of maturity. So that can be one way, at least, to identify projects within the greater ecosystem and landscape as a whole that, or maybe things that you can focus on. But then the other point I wanted to make is that within that landscape, like seeing all those boxes and how do you make sense of it? It's kind of challenging. That kind of makes a point for we need more solutions from the cloud native landscape there. So instead of individual tools and individual projects, knowing how do we pull some of those together to solve higher level problems? What are solutions that we can make out of all these projects in there? And so we see that, I think we'll see that more over time as well, is a more solutions focused point of view for the cloud native landscape, as opposed to just individual tools that just keep adding boxes onto a map.
Hey, I want to jump in real quick. We are almost out of time, but there's a question I love to ask, and I will ask both of you guys. What is the weirdest or most surprising thing you've seen somebody do with Crossplane?
Well, that is a really good question.
The first thing that comes to mind to me, this is maybe almost a trope now in the infrastructure management space, but one of our product managers who worked at Upbound for a while, I think Grant, was it Grant? I think it was Grant, made a Domino's pizza provider for Crossplane. So basically, you can order a pizza declaratively through the Crossplane API. I'm not sure exactly I didn't look at the code, but as I mentioned before, an interesting thing about Crossplane is it, make sure that things are always in your desired state. So I'm not sure if that means I desire pizza, so it's just always going to be ordering me pizza, or whether it just gives me the one and says, so that was your desired state. It's definitely one of the more unusual things.
That's great. Jared, anything from you?
That's probably one of the first ones that came to my mind as well. But then, I think that there's maybe not as interesting or zany as that, but there's a lot of use cases that we find for running the sites and infrastructure that we use to power other projects as well. And making like we started down a path as well of that somebody in the community created a GitHub provider, so you can manage objects and repositories and users and teams and organizations inside of GitHub and GitLab as well. And so using Crossplane to manage the GitHub organization that hosts the Crossplane project, and so you're having a little bit of like inception there, was kind of one that comes to mind as well. Of hey, it's got an API, let's use Crossplane to manage it declaratively and in active reconciliation and avoiding configuration drift and all that sort of stuff as well. So that one's interesting too.
Very cool.
Well, guys, this has been a fast hour. Sometimes I think it goes slow, but this may set a record for feeling like it's the fastest anyway. And I also like the way how you guys hand off. It's really good to each other. So we always end with two questions, which in this case is going to be four, which is what are your favorite text editor and scripting language?
Nick, you want to go ahead on that one first?
That is a really challenging one. I think probably text editor in spirit. I'm more in the Vim camp, although sadly, I use Visual Studio Code these days in Vim mode, so it feels like I'm using Vim. Scripting language, well, I was a Python developer for most of my career, so probably Python, if you would consider that a scripting language.
And then, nice, I like the bell. And then, so for me, I have a little bit of shame about it now, but I do kind of go back to my deep Microsoft roots that I started my career, working on Windows Server and working as an intern there, even where I do find that I still have a lot of muscle memory for an editor that comes along with Visual Studio Code. I definitely did that, and then also I don't use it anymore these days, but I have had some fun with PowerShell. It is weird. I don't think this camp here is going to like it, but PowerShell is definitely interesting for scripting language. 2 dings for Nick and 2 bars for Jared.
PowerShell is a vast improvement over anything that came before it. Oh my goodness!
Thank you, Jonathan. We'll agree with that.
It's not my favorite, but it is so much better.
Well, guys, this has been great. It's clear this thing has moved along far and fast, and so it'll be great to have you back on one of these months or years. It's been a great show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. So, Jonathan.
It took us a while, I think, to kind of wrap our heads around exactly what they do, exactly how Crossplane works. You know, I sort of expected more of a dashboard, and that's not what this is. It's not a dashboard, but it's neat. For being able to put all of these things together, essentially inside Kubernetes. That's a really cool idea, and I like to hear that they're kind of eating their own dog food, doing a lot of things. For example, they mentioned their GitHub account. They apparently control with the GitHub integration inside Crossplane, and that's neat. Didn't get to ask them quite. You know, there's a lot of questions that I would like to be able to have time to ask. We do need to have them back. Like there at the very end, we pulled up their card on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's website, and it said 99% written in Go. And it's like, oh, I want to ask them about Go, but we're out of time. So it's a neat project. And if I ever dive into Kubernetes, like if I ever do block out those couple of days, I think I will definitely have to spend some of that time looking at Crossplane because it looks pretty cool.
Well, I have no idea if this applies or not, but the idea of a control plane, which I had not thought much about in just in a general way, would be relevant to a big topic that came up at this distributed web camp under the redwoods that I was at for half of last week. This put on by the Internet Archive, where conversation went to how do we control our own lives when we get our own personal AIs, the ones that know all our property, all our health, all our finances, all our everything else, but don't leak out into the world. And how do we control how they leak out into the world? But the conversation went around to, oh wow, if I can do all this stuff, how do I control it? and so I don't know. Just listening to these guys made me think a lot about that. It's not relevant necessarily what they're doing. Go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just thinking next time we have them back, or maybe in the after show, we can ask: Is there a plugin? Can you control something like ChatGPT or any of the other machine learning platforms via Crossplane? And I bet the answer is yes. Somebody has already made that happen.
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean, if you think of it, so there are open source versions of GPTs and large and the rest of it, and somebody demonstrated. They took everything I wrote for Linux Journal, which I gave them, put and had the model trained on that, and then asked it questions. And this is all offline, right? And but if you want the big backplane, as it were, of the latest GPT itself and the intelligence that comes from that, and downloading that parts of that model, you have to know where what you've got that's trained on you ends and where the stuff that you're getting from the world begins. And it's just it's so early in where that's going, but it just really felt portentous.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah. So what do you got to plug? I see Hackaday behind you.
Yeah, I like pulling this up as part of my background. So there's hackaday.com. You can follow my work there. I had the trifecta of original content articles. That's Hackaday's long form articles. I had 3 of them queued up at the same time. There's the one about Meshtastic, which has a plug back to this show. One about, of course, the Red Hat debacle. And then, of course, there's the security column that goes live every Friday. And there you go. You've got them all right there. And make sure to check those out. Really proud of all 3 of those articles. They both went pretty well. Had a lot of community feedback, and some people thought I was nuts, and some people thought it was great. Which, you know, that's always a good place to be, where not everybody agrees with you, but some people do. Oh yeah, and don't forget the Untitled Linux show. Thank you, Ant. Don't forget that. If you're not on Club TWiT, you really should be. It's only $7 a month. Goodness, that is 1 cup of Starbucks coffee a month. It will get you into Club TWiT, and we have some. Not only can you get the ad-free versions of shows, but you also have some dedicated shows like the Untitled Linux Show. That is mine, where we talk about Linux news and how-tos, and it's a lot of fun. You should be there too.
And you don't have to wait in line like you do at Starbucks,
right.
Which is
it's a much better experience. Nobody's going to misspell your name on your coffee cup. Nobody's going to call you out something weird. Mary with an E, your coffees are none of that.
Well, it's also, I just read that like only 25% or something like that of Starbucks action is actually in the store anymore. So you could drive to the Starbucks store and there's lots of room in the parking lot, but the line of cars goes out to the street. It's weird. People don't want to leave their cars. So next week, I'm actually prepared with this time. Is Golda Velez. She's a friend, and she was at the thing I just talked about where we were talking about at the DWeb camp under the redwoods in far northern California, where I got a flat tire driving out. By the way, which I have not had experience changing a tire in a long time, but there it was. But Golda's great. She's really smart, very original. She's doing a lot of on-the-ground work with all kinds of stuff. So she's going to be up next week. And until then, I'm Doc Searls. This is Floss Weekly. We'll see you then.
It's midweek, and you really want to know even more about the world of technology.
So you should check out Tech News Weekly, the show where we talk to and about the people making and breaking the tech news.
It's the biggest news. We talk with the people writing the stories that you're probably reading. We also talk between ourselves about the stories that are getting us even more excited about tech news this week.
So if you're excited, well, then join us. Head to twit.tv/TNW to subscribe.